I think what Vanessa's just been talking about reminds me a lot about the discussions in Deleuzian theory of, it's officially called arborescence and rhizomes, but I'm going to be referring to it as trunks and nodes. A trunk is where there's a strong fixity that becomes the basis of meaning. So your life world becomes like a tree. You have a trunk from which everything emanates, and then you have branches and roots that spread out from it, which are relative to the trunk. Whereas a node is a point in a network that's connected to other points, that doesn't require a central trunk. Deleuzian theory obviously is aiming for a passage from trunks to nodes, or a replacement of trunks by nodes, and overlaps a lot with dialogical methodologies, dialogical approaches. This is something that's very much there in Deleuze's own theory and the applications, the ideas of sort of the role of philosophy and of therapy and so on in Deleuzian theory. What I would suggest is that the 7 stages all have parallels in particular forms of trunks or nodes. The first stage, the universalist stage, where it's believed that reality is, there is a universal reality that in some sense is known, or knowable, and that this is what fixes meaning. Basically, all that's recognised as existing is the trunk. The recognition of contradiction being disruptive of that. The second stage, the trunk is identified not simply with reality in the usual sense, but with meaning. It may be that meaning is fused with reality in this kind of sense, but whoops.
Oh, go away.
Something which is not of the trunk on this perspective is viewed as meaningless, and therefore has to be repressed, has to be put out of consciousness, out of the system of meaning. So the system of meaning is still maintained as being solely about the trunk, and anything that's other, though it may on some level be recognised as existing, is something to be feared and something that can't be consciously acknowledged if one's fixated at this stage. Once one starts to recognise the social construction of the trunk itself, are we still going? Once one recognises the social construction of the trunk itself, one's past the point where there's either meaning or meaninglessness, where meaning has to be defined in relation to a particular trunk. One may now recognise that there are many possible systems of meaning, therefore many possible trunks, but one may still retain the attachment to one's own trunk as a point of reference. So one then says that there's many trunks, but this one is my trunk, and fixates on that particular trunk as the one that one has an attachment to. So the others are recognised as existing, maybe even as having some legitimacy in their own right, but are not internalised and not allowed inside. At the fourth stage, we're now talking about the point where the possibility of the existing trunk not being adequate, even on internal terms, not being adequate for the self, begins to be recognised. A person would then start being able to maybe play with aspects of the different trunks, or identify with part of them, or think through their logics. But here what we see is that the trunk of the self is replaced by an idea of a future trunk, or an imaginary trunk, which is the eventual unification of all the different perspectives into a single perspective. One allows the other perspectives in as long as they're viewed as potential outgrowths, potential branches of a future trunk. So although the trunk no longer exists as something which is directly present, it's still operative, but as a goal, as a telos, as something to be tending towards, which gives the motivation for the openness towards the other trunks.
So liberalism.
Yeah. I think there's a tendency for liberals and Marxists to settle at this level. The idea in a liberal framework is that if everyone discusses and deliberates together, they will arrive at something that's satisfactory to everyone, which will be a particular social order, which will be the future trunk. With Marxists, this may be the idea of the historical process, the idea of the eventual unification of humanity in some future society. And this can lead to quite a lot of resistance to going further than this stage.
So in liberalism, we're talking about Habermas?
Yeah. Rawls to some degree, and yeah. At the next stage, we get to the point where the inadequacy of the trunk has gone further. The trunk of the self is replaced with a void, but because the individual will is still conceived in trunkist terms, it's believed one needs a trunk in order to act, one needs a trunk in order to create meaning. This void takes the place of a trunk. So we have the function of the trunk remains in place, but it no longer has a positive content. It's replaced by a void. This is the position that that people are fearing being put in. This is why there's a lot of resistance to dialogism. It's a reason for a lot of the hostility to post-structuralism and to social constructivism, because the fear is that where it will reach and where it will end is this stage of replacing the trunk with a void. At its most stark, someone taking this position would take the position that nothing means anything, nothing has any point. There's no point in acting because there is no basis in a trunk.
How does that relate to absolute relativism? So where would that be?
Absolute relativism would in some ways be sort of pass through that.
Okay.
It would be a sense that everything is context specific, but the derivation from relativism of the idea that there's no point, the derivation of nihilism from relativism is really what would happen at this stage. Mm-hmm. So it would be a kind of, because nothing exists in the form of a trunk, therefore nothing exists. Mm-hmm. What one has not yet come up with at this point is the idea that things can exist in the alternative form of nodes. So the failure of the form of the trunk is taken to be a failure of meaning as such, therefore an impossibility of action, and also is taken as impossibility of the self, an impossibility of will.
So a node cannot be imagined at this stage?
Yes.
Okay.
What I think happens at the sixth stage as a passage through, a passage beyond this, very often it can go one of two ways. Either the trunk is either the void is recoalesced into a trunk, but a trunk that's still in a certain sense a void, that's conceived as contingent, for example, and that attempts to form connections with nodes. Or we see the void defined, the nodes begin to be seen, but they're defined as other in relation to the void. Remembering the void still takes the form of a trunk in a certain sense. So they're seen, but they're rejected. They're seen, but they're part of the meaninglessness that the void is constructing. At the seventh stage, what we see is the nodes finally become conceivable as nodes. The position of the self is then itself becomes a node, or even several nodes in a system of nodes. So instead of simply recognizing contingency, one moves on to embracing contingency. One becomes a part of contingency, and so it's no longer something external, something frightening. It's now something that's a part of the structure of being. At that point, one attains the possibility of planetary consciousness, the possibility of rhizomatic consciousness, rhizomatic thought, and of ways of relating which don't rely on a trunk. So what we see in a way is the cumulative breaking down through each of these stages of the trunk as a mode of thought, and each of the stages represents a kind of a fixity, a place at which people can become fixed with a certain amount of what's left of the trunk and can resist moving on to the further breaking down of the trunk. But there are also a set of stages that one can in principle pass through to get to the breaking down of the trunk, the construction of nodes instead.
So otherness in here, so what shifts from 1 to 7 in terms of how we see each other?
In 1 and 2 there's a tendency for what is other to be rejected as either not existing or as meaningless or as valueless. By the time we're getting to stage 7, otherness is itself part of the web of relations. Because everything's interconnected, otherness becomes less of a definitive either or relation and becomes more a matter of connections, of degrees of connection.